Hi everyone. A few years ago I picked myself up one of these. It's a Sony MiniDisc player from Japan. Problem is, it doesn't work. It's never worked. And it's really ugly. I don't know if you can see that, but there are scratches all over it. Let's fix it. Just a little interjection from future me here for a second before we get started. And yes, you've kind of caught me in between hairstyles here. But this video ended up taking me a lot longer and went in a lot of different directions than I had originally intended. I do have chapter breaks down below if you want to use those. And, if you want to watch a section here or there, come back later, watch the rest, that's fine. I am going to be posting a video on my second channel, kind of an adjunct to this video, kind of anticipating some of the comments I'm going to get, because I know I'm going to get comments on certain things in here. So look for that. It may be a couple days after this, or maybe not, but I'll post a link up in the corner here and also down below once I do post that. So look for that. Also sign up for my second channel. But anyway, back to the video. I want to talk just a little bit about MiniDisc in general, because it feels weird not to give a bit of background on the subject of one of my videos. This isn't going to be a full history lesson, but I feel like I should at least talk about MiniDisc as I experienced it, and why this is the first time it's appearing on my channel, where I've covered a bunch of other dead audio formats such as cassette tape, super audio CD, and even quadraphonic 8-track. The answer to that last question is easy. I'm inclined to make videos when I have a point to make that no one else has, or at least not to my satisfaction. But plenty of other high-quality channels, including Techmoan, This Does Not Compute, and various others, have already covered MiniDisc far better than I ever could. Frankly, after watching their videos, I took whatever thoughts I'd had on talking about MiniDisc and just put them on a shelf, along with this player. I have no notes, as the saying goes, on what they've already done. So why do this now? Boredom, mostly. And I pass by this player every time I park in my garage. It's hard to miss. So I just figured I'd fix it and film it. I talked in my cassette comeback video about how that format should probably just stay dead. But if there's one format that I wouldn't mind coming back, it's MiniDisc. MiniDisc is just fun, and it sounds surprisingly good. Apologies if some of this sounds familiar to those of you who saw that cassette comeback video, but it's all necessary backstory.
I won.
So?
So give me the burrito.
The original compact cassette, or just cassette as we dumb Americans called it, was born out of convenience. It wasn't good. It just wasn't. It was just small. We liked that. We could carry it around, listen to it in our cars, through tiny players on our waist, or big players on our shoulders for when we wanted everyone within a 10-block radius to hear what we were listening to. But we had bigger, better formats for listening in the home when we wanted good sound. Cassette was considered pretty durable. Unlike vinyl or even reel-to-reel tape, you could throw it around, and about the only things you had to worry about were tapes being eaten or snapping inside a wayward mechanism, which was actually fairly common. So probably not really as durable as we thought at the time. It didn't sound good. We all knew it, including the companies that made it, and manufacturers of both decks and tapes did all sorts of things to try to improve the situation. Most of these little tricks did have a marginal effect, and by the end, with the cumulative improvements stacked up, cassette could sound pretty reasonable. But that's if you had the right deck, the right tape, and everything was in perfect order mechanically. But by then, a lot of people were playing tapes on aging decks, or alternatively on new ones built cheaply. And it actually did require a little bit more knowledge than the average person probably had to get the best out of their recordings. So in the late 80s and early 90s, at least 3, and I may be forgetting 1 or 2 here, but in terms of major attempts, 3 formats tried to replace cassette. 2 of these were backed by Sony, and one by Philips, the inventor of the original cassette, along with Matsushita, parent company of Panasonic and Technics. Digital audio tape, or DAT, was a full rethink of cassette tape in the digital age, with smaller tapes, no compression, and the capability of a higher sampling rate than even CD. This scared the bejesus out of the record labels since you could make bit-perfect copies of any CD onto DAT. So for consumer decks, they demanded a pretty onerous copy protection scheme called copy code that would prevent any copying of copyrighted works. It was so onerous that you could reportedly hear it. It worked by inserting a notch filter at 3840 Hz that a recording deck would then listen for. This ended up just delaying the launch of consumer DAT units since Sony essentially refused to implement this form of copy protection, not out of any sense of altruism towards consumers, but because they knew it would kill sales. But that also meant that Sony had missed the boat when consumer decks finally did hit the market years later. Essentially, you can blame the record labels and the US government, who seriously considered legislating the use of copy code, for killing consumer DAT before it ever got off the ground. If you're wondering, Sony ended up launching consumer DAT decks with the same copy protection that DCC and MiniDisc carried. Not copy code, but the Serial Copyright Management System, or as we all unaffectionately acronymed it at the time, SCUMS. SCUMS wasn't really that bad. It was better than copy code at least. You couldn't hear it. You could actually make one copy of a copyrighted work, so you could, for example, copy a CD you had to listen to on another portable or car player, or even for a friend. DAT did do well in professional settings, as you might expect from an early, high-quality, uncompressed digital medium. As a teenager, I actually did some recording in a real recording studio, and they mastered to DAT. This was pretty common for a while. If you own a CD made in the late 80s or early 90s, good chance the master for that CD is just on a little DAT tape, or at least was, since nowadays DAT tapes are known to degrade. Nobody was mastering for 192 kHz in those days. 48 kHz was still better than anything most consumers could listen to. Now let's talk about DCC. DCC, or Digital Compact Cassette, was Philips' stab at replacing the analog cassette format that they invented. This is another format you may think I've ignored on my channel, but again, it's mostly because of how well it's already been covered elsewhere. I am in fact in the process of restoring a DCC 900 unit right now, but I'm not filming it because Colin's saga with his DCC 900 on This Does Not Compute already went there. And oh yeah, Techmoan covered the format too, and so did VWestlife. DCC is also just an incredibly finicky format, and while I've been on kind of a roll lately repairing AV components, including an old Blu-ray player that I keep around to play SACDs on, a Pioneer magazine-style CD changer, and maybe this MiniDisc player, my DCC 900 seems to have multiple issues and is proving a tough nut to crack. YouTube is littered with similar stories about DCC. This is probably the most complex home audio format ever released, so it's maybe not surprising that so much can go wrong with it, especially these first-generation players. Second-gen players were generally more reliable, but they're also pretty expensive and harder to find. In short, it's just tough to get a working example of any kind of DCC deck these days, and it's not a cheap format, to say the least. The failure mode of most DCC decks is such that any first-gen deck you find on eBay that's not listed as having been restored or at least recapped is on its way to an early grave. That includes all models listed as working. Buyer beware. Anyway, assuming you've never watched any of those videos I mentioned, DCC was made to be backward compatible with analog cassettes, but would also support new digital cassettes of the same size and general design. Digital cassettes would record using an MPEG-1 based lossy compression scheme at 384 kbps, which at least somewhat placated the record labels. You couldn't make a perfect copy of a CD on a DCC tape. And you've already seen that DCC included SCUMS, like every other digital recording format. Sony's second attempt at replacing the original cassette in the home was MiniDisc. MiniDisc is an optical format like CD, but with much smaller discs housed in a fairly tough but still very thin outer shell. Importantly, the discs are rewritable, just like cassettes. The format uses Sony's proprietary ATRAC compression, which had a rough start, but was continuously refined, and by the time of my MDS JE640 with ATRAC 3, would sound pretty transparent at its native 292 kbps. I'll talk a little bit more about the sound of this player later. The size of the media was important, especially in Sony's home country of Japan, Portable players started off small and only got smaller, and you could easily fit 10 or 15 minidiscs in a bag or a purse without it seeming like overkill. Unlike with DCC or regular cassettes, minidiscs supported all the same features of CD, like instant track access, random and program play, and they suffered none of the issues with tapes breaking or being stretched or eaten. Minidisc never really caught on in the US, but it was monstrously popular in Japan. It did, in fact, replace cassettes there for a while. Most of the discs and players you see for sale today, even on US sites, come from Japan. But it's not for Sony's lack of trying elsewhere. Minidisc did do okay in the US, it just never fully achieved what Sony set out to do. Think of it like the PSP of audio. Sold a lot of units worldwide, never quite dethroned the industry leader or left the lasting impact that Sony hoped. Ultimately, minidisc and DCC, not to mention the last vestiges of analog cassettes, were all really done in by MP3, although minidisc managed to soldier on into the 2000s while DCC was discontinued in 1996. Philips and Sony didn't realize they'd been fighting a war in a parallel universe, one where physical music formats still mattered to the mass market. MP3 was introduced in 1991 and was already catching on in the mid-90s, with the first portable players being introduced later that decade, as I talked about in my old video on the MP-Man, the world's first portable MP3 player. Neither Philips nor Sony seemed to see that coming, nor were either of them prepared for it. I never owned a minidisc player at the time it was on the market. I was a traditionalist to a fault back then, and I stuck with CDs and standard cassette tapes until I bought my first MP3 player, which was actually an RCA disc-based player that would play either music CDs or data CDs filled with MP3s. I thought this was a good compromise to hedge my bets, and actually I used this player for quite a long time. My first pure digital audio player was a 4th-gen iPod some years later. Today, I still have a dedicated player. Again, once I get attached to something, it's hard for me to let go. But ironically, it's now a Sony Walkman that will do high-res files along with basically any other digital format that isn't made by Apple. But looking back, I regret being a minidisc holdout. Minidisc was just cool, and I'd hoped to finally be able to experience that when I decided to buy my first home deck, which was this used MDS JE640 that I bought online from Japan. It was listed as working, in good condition, but it is neither of those things. Just goes to show you can't trust everything that comes from Japan. It's an honest country for the most part, but nothing is 100%. I tried this player out and almost returned it, but would have paid as much to ship it back as I'd paid for it to begin with. So it has sat on a shelf for years now. I just think it's about time to do something about that. At this point, there's no way to get the disc out without opening it up, so let's do that. And just in case you were having trouble seeing what the player was doing, I've moved the camera a little bit, and there you go. This is an extremely common problem, apparently, on these minidisc players, and I gotta give credit to Techmoan for his series of minidisc videos that, one of which, towards the end, he just had a short little video talking about replacing the loading belts in these mechanisms. All right, now when Techmoan did this, he did not take the mechanism out of the machine. I'm gonna try doing it the way that he did it, but I have a feeling that my belt is completely gone, turned to goo, so I may end up needing to take mine out of the machine. If I can even get this first part done of unclipping this. There we go. Okay, so that part is done, and then just got to unclip this. Slide that up. So it's a little hard to tell, but it looks to me on mine like I have parts of the belt on both pulleys. So I'll try and get that off, and if I can't, I'll have to take this whole thing out. Okay, well that came out without too much of a problem. I didn't want to disconnect the ribbon cables, but I had to, and they weren't too tough. Hopefully they go back in. Now let's see if I can get this clip. Yeah. All right, and now I have a little better access. Yeah, this is gonna, and maybe you can see this better. Let me zoom in a little more. Yeah, it's just gonna be a little bit of labor, I think, to get this cleaned off. Sure, it just looks like I'm just making a mess, but it'll be fine in the end. Well, yep, typical Sony belt, but I've got it all off, or at least enough of it off. I've cleaned it as well as I can, and this is just a loading belt. This is not going to do anything to the sound as long as it works. That's the important thing. So let's get the new belt on there. So I bought these off eBay. These were specifically listed for this model. They obviously look a little different. They're clear. I don't know what they actually are. They look like something you might see in an orthodontics office. But again, the important thing is that it works. So Nat just committed suicide in my mini disc player. Okay, well, hopefully this just works. I guess we'll find out. Or maybe not. What if I just put the disc in? What did I do wrong? Okay, some of you were probably screaming at your screen right there because I don't think I had quite lined up something correctly internally in the mechanism when I put it back together. I think I've got it set now. So let's see now what this does. I don't know what's on this disc. I think it has some music. Looks like it does, 17 tracks. Let's bring the camera a little closer. All right, 17 tracks, no name. I got these discs off eBay. I knew that they were recorded on already, which is kind of why I wanted them. I don't know what the music is, but just see if it starts playing. I'll hook it up later. But yeah, I've got levels. It's playing. Seems to be working. Let's try ejecting. Looks pretty good. Let's try it again. Yep. All right. So a little bit more, slightly more involved of a repair than when Techmoan did it, just because my belt had completely broken down, as Sony belts are wont to do. So if you've got one of these players, be prepared for either situation. You may or may not have to take the whole thing apart. But I'm not going to stop here because I'm actually going to tackle this monstrosity. This cannot stand. Those of you, I don't know how many of you would have watched my compact restoration video. I do both audio and computers and other stuff on this channel. And had a case like this on a compact computer that I bought, ended up spray painting it. And so that's what I'm going to do again. That project turned out really nice, and hopefully this one will too. So I'm going to take this thing outside and give it a once over, and hopefully it'll look basically good as new. After that, I'm going to do some testing, and we'll see what this mini disc player can really do, and what mini disc as a format can really do. I wanted to preserve this sticker because even though it's a little unsightly, it instantly marks this as a Japanese unit. And not that I'd ever try to fool anyone, I think keeping it will make the final result look a little more original. A little hot air and it came off easily, though there is some dirt and gunk stuck under parts of it that made it tough to stick fully flat again later, even with some new glue. Here you can see a little bit of the original color. It's a little more gold, a little less dirt colored. I started out by sanding the surface, and there's no need to get to bare metal, just enough sanding to make the paint stick. I wasn't too worried about the color, because as you've probably noticed, the faceplate and cases on Sony's champagne-colored models are already mismatched from the factory. The case is close to what DuPont would call Aztec Gold, paint code 94959, whereas the faceplate is really champagne or even rose gold. Still, it looked like the color I bought was pretty close to what the case was originally supposed to be. Please ignore my technique here. This is just the first of about 7 coats, and initially I'm mostly trying to cover the really bad spots. I start smoothing it out later. Still, one thing I didn't realize about gold, or maybe just metallic paints, is how hard it is to get them to look even. With normal paint, it doesn't really matter if you get a little more or less paint in one area, as long as it's all enough to cover what's behind it. But the metallic particles in paint like this really make it obvious where it's uneven. I ended up going a little too far. My 6th coat was so good that I thought I'd just go a little further and make it perfect, but I should have known when to quit. I did a few coats of clear coat just to protect it and make it possible to handle. It'd be no fun having gold glitter coming off in my hands every time I pick this thing up. Don't worry too much if that looks uneven here too. That's why you do multiple coats. This was just the first. By the last coat though, I was working in the dark. I just wanted to have this thing done. I used a purple glue stick to get that sticker back on. It wasn't going to stick by itself anymore. These glue sticks are much better than super glue because it's basically permanent, but it doesn't stick much stronger than tape. So it's reversible. Next, I decided that while I was at it, I may as well try to do something about the display, which was also all scratched up. Here's a more obvious look at it. I've seen a bunch of ways that people remove scratches from clear plastic like this, but I decided to just use something I already had: guitar polish. Plastic polishes, Brasso, automotive polishes, even toothpaste, they're all basically the same thing. Some kind of compound with a little bit of light abrasiveness that removes the scratched layer of material. This stuff is made specifically for the clear plastic finishes on electric guitars, and I've had good luck with it, so I figured it should work. I spent about 20 minutes applying both stages of this compound, and this is the result. Pretty good, I think. Those scratches on the bottom, I don't know if I can ever get out because they almost seem like they're where the plexiglass was actually cut. Polish isn't going to fix it. The faceplate itself has some scratches too, but there's probably nothing I can do about them. I know from experience that this champagne color is right on the surface, and it's most likely just white plastic underneath. There's also a little bit of a faux brushed finish on this thing, so any attempt at buffing out those scratches would definitely just make things worse. That's okay. The machine as a whole looks a lot better than it did, and I'd now consider it to be in the good condition that the seller described it as when I first bought it. And it only took me several days of labor and about $40 in supplies to get to that point. Now that it's repaired, I'll first just run through some basics on this model. The MDS JE640 was released in Japan in September of 2000 for a price of 49,000 yen, which at that time would have been about $458. Since I know people like to do this, let's further adjust that now for inflation and say $458 in September of 2000 equates to $853 in July of 2024. So definitely not cheap, but also not top of the line. In fact, this was about the middle of Sony's range at the time. Differentiating features from lower models in the line include a 2-line display that's actually pretty highly detailed and still very bright on my machine, MDLP support for a longer record time at lower bit rates, direct disc and track naming via a standard PS2 keyboard, pitch control, 2 optical inputs and 1 optical output, and a headphone jack. I've listened via the headphone output on this unit, and it is a typical Sony crowd-pleasing headphone amp, with a wide soundstage and emphasized bass and treble that don't sound very accurate, but also make it hard to complain. It sounds good, and it sounds like a Sony, even if it isn't 100% accurate. MiniDisc was continually improved right up to the end, and this model does not include the latest or the highest end features like HiMD or NetMD, nor the last versions of ATRAC. Now that you know my deck is repaired, I can show you what happens when you try to make a copy of a copy on a SCUMS supporting device. This is me testing recording on my DCC deck from an already copied MiniDisc over an optical connection. SCUMS won't let you do that, although you can do it over an analog connection. Either way, the music's being compressed a second time, but it might sound marginally better with a digital connection. If I did have the original CD that the MiniDisc was copied from, I could just use that to make another second-generation all-digital copy on the DCC deck. I should mention that since my unit is Japanese, it runs on 100 volts, not the 120 of the US system. I'm using a step-down transformer with it. It may not be necessary since there's a tolerance built into these power supplies, and I'm not convinced Sony didn't just use the same ones in the US and Japan. But it's a lot of time and effort to have wasted if I do burn anything out by using the wrong voltage, so may as well just be safe. So let's see what this thing can actually do. Welcome to the dry, technical part of the video where I show you lots of screenshots of waveforms and spectrograms. Feel free to skip to the end at this point, but to me, this is the interesting bit. The plan is to compare the ATRAC algorithm with other common formats of the time, making some test recordings from CD over the optical connection and then transferring them to my PC to look at and compare directly with the original CD tracks. I'll then do the same with some MP3 files in both low and high bit rates, similar AAC files, and since I know you guys would be mad if I didn't do this, I'll even test analog cassette tape. I chose a few more or less random recordings with some general characteristics. First, I just wanted something I knew was mixed and mastered well, and Tears for Fears' Songs from the Big Chair fits that bill. So I'll grab the first 2 tracks off that, Shout and The Working Out. These songs also turned out to have some particular challenges for these compression schemes, but we'll get to that. Next, another older CD, but let's try some metal and see how the compression does with that. This is Queensryche's first EP, super old school for 80s metal, but you could hear what they'd become already. Anyway, I recorded this twice, once in normal SP mode, which works at 292 kilobits per second, and once in the 66 kilobit per second LP4 super long play mode, just to see how much worse it is. This deck has a little red light for when a recording's made in LP mode, and it shows it in playback too. You can mix and match LP and non-LP recordings on the same disc. That light will show you what it's playing at a given time. If it's off, that's just normal SP mode. Finally, I wanted to try something that I knew was brick-walled. For those of you who somehow aren't familiar with the loudness wars, I'm going to link to a video up in the corner and in the video description about it. But the TLDR version is that over time, CDs got louder and shittier sounding, until they reached maximum crap by the late 90s. It all happened pretty quickly, and it's why so many people think CDs sound like garbage now. Well, it's not the CD format, it's the mastering that became trendy during the CD era. I had never really known who first made this a trend until I watched this guy.
1995 is the year the loudness war started, with What's the Story? Morning Glory by Oasis.
And hey, if a British guy who happens to be an audio engineer is going to tell me Oasis is responsible for all the world's brickwalling, I'm not going to argue. Here's a link to that video too, and another down in the description. I can't find my copy of What's the Story Morning Glory, or maybe I sold it, but I think Do You Know What I Mean from their Be Here Now album should suffice. And yeah, that looks like some serious brickwalling to me. We'll see how ATRAC handles it. Incidentally, I've recently been rewatching Lost, and I don't know how I never noticed before that Charlie's band Driveshaft is definitely just Oasis, with the two feuding bad boy brothers and songs with titles like You All Everybody. You all everybody. You all everybody. I feel like if you put a song called You All Everybody on Be Here Now, it would fit right in. This player supports PC keyboard input, so I thought I may as well try it for title entry, and it worked just fine. Much easier than selecting each letter individually via that dial. Next, I figured I'd at least try recording some high-res files to see if the recorder would downsample, and if so, how well. I started with a couple of files from my USB stick, but you see what it does here. And just so you don't think anything else broke, I just put a regular CD in the player while it was doing this, and it instantly recognized the signal. I then tried an SA CD, and the same thing happened. I figured as much. The manual says it will convert signals up to 48 kilohertz, but I thought that might have just been because that's all that really existed at the time. And I guess that's technically true, but sometimes you get lucky with stuff like this, and it's actually more capable than what the manual says. Next, I'm going to use my audio interface to transfer the digital data from the MiniDisc to the PC, with the MiniDisc player connected via optical to the interface, and the interface connected to my PC via USB. I had a lot of trouble getting this to work, but ultimately found the right combination of drivers, protocols, and software, and managed to finally get it working with the Reaper DAW on my PC. You see it transferring over in real time here. This should be more or less bit perfect from what would otherwise be decoded during regular playback, so we can see what ATRAC does to the sound. Incidentally, you may notice that I'm working in 24 bits in a lot of this footage. That's just kind of the default working bit depth in audio. Even the ATRAC Type R DSP in this MiniDisc player has a 24-bit working environment. The files themselves are all 16-bit, so nothing's being added here. In other words, don't worry about it. More important is the sample rate, which is always 44.1 kilohertz. By the way, look at that Oasis file. Yes, that is technically a waveform. So that's the MiniDisc audio transferred over, and by the way, did you notice we were technically bypassing scums? That was a digital copy of a copy. That's the benefit of using a pro audio interface. Of course, if I had a NetMD player, I could have just looked at the files directly, but I don't. Next, I used exact audio copy to extract the original CD files to uncompressed WAV files, and I used that data to then rip each song to 128 kbps MP3 and AAC, then max quality VBR MP3 and AAC. I did this using Lame for MP3 and iTunes for AAC. I did 2 flavors of each codec because I think the lower quality files represent the early 2000s era and would have been this player's direct competition at that time, when storage space was at more of a premium and a lot of people were using players with 512 megs or less. The higher quality files are kind of a best case scenario for each format, even today. Yes, preset 0 VBR is better than 320 kbps CBR. Fight me. Lastly, I knew I'd get comments about it if I didn't also somehow test analog cassette tape. I ordered some new blank cassettes. The only kind still being mass-produced are normal bias tapes, so that's what I got. Even so, I have no idea how old these are. You can still get chrome or metal tapes, but outside of some limited micro-brand production runs, they will basically all be new old stock that have been sitting on shelves decaying for literally decades. I'm not sure which is worse, to be honest, and I didn't want to spend $50 on this anyway. So normal bias it is. I think that's more representative of what most people were using back in the day anyway, especially for pre-recorded tapes, and certainly today for anyone just getting into the format now. Before recording, I cleaned the entire mechanism with some alcohol and even demagnetized both tape wells. I made basically the same recordings on cassette as on the other formats, though I recorded shout 3 times so I could test both Dolby B and C as well. I made sure to carefully set the levels for each recording according to the manual's guidance to let them peak at the Dolby symbol on the display, whether or not Dolby noise reduction is actually on. Other than the 2 extra recordings of shout, all other recordings were made without noise reduction, since that's how most people today would be making recordings on a new deck, and any pre-recorded cassettes you buy today will be without noise reduction too. Dolby B and C are unfortunately not licensable anymore. I transferred my cassette files to PC with this thing, which I've used before, and it actually works well. It's got more than enough bandwidth to support 44.1 kHz 16-bit files, and it doesn't seem to introduce any artifacts or noise of its own that I've noticed. I then manually aligned each of the digital recordings with the master CD track. I zoomed in on each track individually and made sure they were all perfectly matched, sample for sample. Then I did a trick I've read about online to compare 2 tracks. I inverted each of the compressed tracks, then one at a time I mixed and rendered a new track from a combination of the CD track and each of the lossy compressed tracks. That gave me a track for each format showing only the differences between it and the CD. This wasn't possible with the cassette tracks due to the slight speed variance that's basically inherent in any analog format. There do exist cassette decks with quartz speed lock, similar to some turntables, but there can still be small variations between quartz beats, so it would probably still be impossible to really line it up perfectly, which would throw off the whole comparison. But there's still stuff we can look at between cassette and minidisc and cassette and CD, and I'll get to that. For all the other files, looking at the difference tracks between them and CD can tell us something about how much was lost in the compression, and from where. We can also just compare the recordings directly, which I think shows some interesting results. We'll be looking at Audacity showing each track's waveform, which is a measure of its amplitude over time, and its spectrogram, which is a measure of its frequencies over time. Unfortunately, I can't play you much of anything due to YouTube's Content ID, but I may be able to sprinkle a few seconds of music in here and there. To make sure everything's hopefully clear, when looking at these waveforms and spectrograms, each cluster of data is one song. The gaps in between are the gaps between songs. The song order is the same across all recordings except cassette, where I changed it up a little bit just to make sure I tested Dolby B and C. I have cassette in its own project window as a result. But when I'm scrolling across horizontally within the same window here, you're looking at tracks that should ideally be showing the exact same data. I'm also going to be going back and forth between the main tracks and the difference tracks. Remember that the difference tracks only show what's changed between that track and the original CD. We want there to be as little data in the difference tracks as possible. The less data there, the smaller the difference from the original file. That also means that the codecs that show a smaller amount of data in those difference tracks performed better than those showing larger amounts of data. They are closer to the original. So, time for some observations. We'll look at the difference tracks first and get the obvious out of the way. Yes, all of the lossy tracks are different from the CD originals, but the more modern the codec and the higher the quality setting, the less different they are. Looking at MiniDisc versus the 128K files, which I think are what MiniDisc would have been most closely competing with for most of its life, MiniDisc's waveform more closely matches the original CD recordings than low bitrate MP3 or AAC. AAC sometimes gets close, but it's only with MiniDisc in LP4 mode that it really beats it. This is still pretty impressive for both MP3 and AAC, given the large disparity in bitrate between them and the 292 kbps ATRAC in use here. By the way, if you want to know what one of these difference tracks actually sounds like, first let me warn you to turn your volume down a bit, because these are pretty noisy. But here's the MiniDisc difference track for shout. And here's 128K MP3. and 128K AAC. Let's switch over to the main tracks. The spectrograms get more interesting. The CDs I recorded all have frequencies all the way up to 22 kilohertz, which makes sense since you should see a frequency response that's just under half the sampling rate. The Oasis CD is showing frequencies even higher than that, but I think that has to be some kind of artifact of the brick walling. It's probably basically noise, although I can't hear it to be able to tell you. ATRAC on MiniDisc shaves off some of those high frequencies, but actually leaves the strongest of them intact. In both Tears for Fears songs, though, there seem to be harmonics of some kind above 15 kilohertz, and it just chops those right out. 128K MP3 and AAC both have a much lower and harder limit for the high frequencies than ATRAC does. They both seem to top out at around 16 or 17 kilohertz. But they also both reproduce that noise or harmonic at 16 kilohertz in the working hour. If you look at the ATRAC LP4 recording of the Queensryche track, you can definitely see how it's saving bits. It has an even lower frequency threshold than 128K MP3, around 13 kilohertz. If we then move over to look at this abomination of an Oasis track, it looks like ATRAC is trying a lot harder to keep its frequency response intact than either 128K MP3 or AAC. Though MP3, to its credit, is reaching way up there to 22 kilohertz occasionally and busting right through that lower limit it has on most other tracks. Let's look at the higher quality files. This is more representative of what people would have been using towards the end of MiniDisc's lifespan, and it should be a relatively fair fight, since ATRAC in SP mode is 292 kbps CBR, while both the MP3 and AAC files here are between 250 and 290 kbps in VBR. First, here are the waveforms, and both MP3 and AAC are clearly more accurate to the original waveforms than ATRAC. You can pretty much ignore the LP4 track here, as that's not a fair fight with its very low bitrate. Looking at the spectrograms, we can see that both MP3 and AAC still have a pretty hard cutoff right around 20 kilohertz that ATRAC can more often exceed. But overall, both MP3 and AAC are preserving more of the music at high frequencies than ATRAC is. For example, both are now preserving the harmonics in both Tears for Fears songs. Moving over to the Oasis track, it actually looks like MP3 still had a pretty tough time, and ATRAC did its best, but AAC is clearly the winner here, preserving basically all of the high frequencies from the CD, including a lot of that apparent noise. If we look at the difference tracks again, we can hopefully tell a little about where they're saving bits, since the bit rates on all the codecs now are pretty close. Keep in mind that more saturated colors means more data in these spectrograms, which, since these tracks show differences from the original files, means more data being lost or changed by each algorithm at those frequencies. It seems clear that despite the sound I get out of this MiniDisc player, ATRAC is cutting more out of the low frequencies than either MP3 or AAC. I have a feeling Sony is just compensating for that with the output profile of their players. Most people were not using MiniDisc for critical home listening or recording from MiniDisc to some other format, so it was fine if they just juiced the bass on the output. Bass is also easier to fake in playback than high frequencies. There's less obvious detail in the lower frequencies than in, say, a high-frequency cymbal crash. You can definitely hear that. To me, this player sounds like it's got a typical Sony V-shaped EQ. Now, I still question whether you'd really hear any difference between MiniDisc and even high-quality MP3 or AAC. I definitely can't. Someone under 20 with a full range of hearing and trained ears might be able to, but just because you think you can doesn't make it true. Lots of people think they can hear things that actual testing says they can't. So personally, I don't think this stuff is all that significant, but it is interesting. It was probably pretty significant for marketing reasons, though, and I remember Apple pushing AAC as sounding better than any other compression format. Let's look at analog cassette. I should first point out that this data is technically uncompressed. It's just digitized from the analog, but I haven't even exported it. This is the straight uncompressed digital recording, just sitting there in memory on my PC. We really can't tell a huge amount from the waveforms because they just don't match up due to the speed variance, so there is no difference track for cassette. Here's a small section I did match up zoomed in, and while it's kind of recognizable, it's clearly not even close to the same. If we look at the spectrogram, the most obvious thing is that blue color all the way up to 22 kilohertz on the cassette track. That's noise. It's tape hiss. As you can see, it's just everywhere on the frequency spectrum. Generally, though, I will say that at least the spectrograms are recognizably the same songs. It's just the cassette only reaches up to about 16 or 17 kilohertz at its best. Now, a better tape might do better, and my deck is rated up to 19 kilohertz with chrome or metal tapes. But that doesn't mean it's ever going to be able to reproduce the higher frequencies as they are on the CD, just that it might be able to capture the strongest ones some more of the time. If we look at the Dolby B and C tracks, we see some results that are interesting to me, at least. As a kid, I was always suspicious of Dolby noise reduction, mostly because my store-bought cassette albums that had it sounded really muffled to me with Dolby turned on. So I usually just left it off when playing those tapes, even though they were supposedly recorded with it on. Later, I did use Dolby B for my own recordings, but only when I knew I'd be playing them back on the same deck. Different decks could sound different from each other when playing back Dolby encoded recordings. I never did switch to Dolby C because I was even more suspicious of what it was doing, but here we can see that it's performing really well. It cut out a lot more noise than Dolby B, and it seems to have preserved almost all of the high frequencies of the music, at least to the extent of the capabilities of the tape. If I was still recording to cassette regularly, I'd definitely be using Dolby C. I'd love to have a Dolby S deck to test that. Maybe someday. I hope I don't need to say this, but yes, while these results are interesting, MiniDisc is vastly superior to cassette. It sounds closer to CD, it has no speed variance, it's more durable, it's more convenient, it's smaller. If you like analog cassettes, you should love MiniDisc. It was a worthy successor. And it's basically as good as it ever was. Cassette is in this weird situation right now where the format itself has actually degraded over time. You can't get a good new mechanism anymore. If you buy a used one, it's going to be problematic in various ways. New cassettes, good new cassettes, they're expensive if you can find them, and they are hard to find. Older cassettes that maybe have just been sitting on a shelf for years are not going to sound as good. Their media has degraded. And there's no Dolby B or C that can be licensed anymore for a new cassette deck or for new store-bought tapes. If you buy into cassette now, you're probably just not going to have as good of an experience as we had back in the day when it was current. And that experience wasn't that great to begin with. With MiniDisc, yeah, you basically have to buy used. And yes, you may need to replace a belt like I just did. But once you get a player working, it's going to work and sound as good as it ever did. And it's going to give you everything and more than cassette ever did. And it's just fun to play around with. I'll bet not many of you did that at the time, so maybe just give it a try. Would I go back to MiniDisc and ditch my little Walkman that plays every digital format under the sun and that I'll basically never be able to fill up? No. If you tell me I could only have one music player for the rest of my life, it's gonna be this one. But in terms of physical media, it doesn't get a lot better than MiniDisc. And I think even today, it's just a fun little format that you could use in everyday life. It's not like some other formats that just don't sound very good, or they're too problematic, or they're too inconvenient. You might get some weird looks from using MiniDisc today, but for some people that might even be the point. Get yourself a portable player and a bunch of blank discs on eBay, make some recordings, go out, have some fun. You officially have my blessing, and I know you've all been on pins and needles hoping for that through this entire video. Anyway, that's about it for now. I hope to see you guys next time.